Today we're going to look at establishing reliability for a scale. So as I mentioned in the lectures for this week, you can't exactly establish validity with statistics. You need to do that more through kind of some specific testing and the way you design your studies. So fortunately, if you use pre-existing measures that have already been validated by someone else, you can kind of assume that that validity piece is taken care of. And what you just need to check for in that case is reliability in your own data set. So I'm going to show you how to do this with this fake scale here called fake communication style. So you'll see that participants are asked to use this 1 to 7 Likert type scale that goes from 1, do not agree, to 7, completely agree. And they've asked the participants to indicate the extent to which they agree with each of the following statements using this scale here. So they have to respond to, I love talking to others, rate that 1 through 7. I can carry on conversations easily, 1 to 7. I spend a lot of time talking on the phone, 1 to 7, and I find conversations boring, 1 to 7. So two things I do want to point out to you is that oftentimes when you're measuring something, you are going to have an item that is reverse coded. So it means that it's kind of flipped, the sense of it is flipped, so that this is just to make sure that participants are reading questions properly, and also to make sure that you're not accidentally measuring something you don't want to be measuring. So in this case, though, if you were to combine all of these before flipping this, you would run into some problems. Another thing I'm going to point out is that you might sometimes see the word subscale. So sometimes a construct is made up of a lot of different components and or different pieces or different variables make up kind of this global construct. And that again ties into the validity piece. But if you see something called a subscale, it just means that it's a piece, there might be like 20 questions and it's divided into a few subscales, and the questions that fall under that subscale actually make that variable. So in this case, in our fake communication style scale, there could be a chattiness subscale, there could be a talking over others subscale, a listening subscale, etc. And then each of those subscales would have their own little set of items that you would then turn into one score to represent that particular item. And then usually for a validated scale, there's going to be some sort of instruction about how to score it. So you might, take the mean of these 4 items, or you might take the total, or there might be some other thing to do, but that'll be clearly outlined in the original paper that outlines how the scale was validated. And the way you can find that is by looking up the reference itself, which I will show you shortly. But before I get to that, let's talk about how to actually calculate reliability in StatsCloud. Okay, so we have a group of participants that have responded to those 4 questions. So we have 49 people that responded to those 4 questions. So we're not going to do anything. We are just going to calculate the reliability. So to do this, if you recall, we're looking at Cronbach's alpha, and we want to see if these 4 items are all measuring the same thing. So that would mean that we expect to see the same kind of pattern of response across the 4 items. So someone who's going to be high on item 1, we'd want them to be high on item 2, high on item 3, and then low on item 4, because keep in mind that item is in the opposite direction. Same thing for each thing. So that keep in mind the scale goes from 1 to 7. So high means closer to 7, low means closer to 1, or if they're at the midpoint, you'd want them to be at the midpoint across all the measures. So anyway, to calculate the reliability, you're going to click on Analyses, and you're going to click on Run Your First Analysis. And you need to scroll all the way to the bottom, and you are going to find the reliability analysis. So we're not going to worry about Spearman-Brown, but we are going to click on Cronbach's alpha. And then you need to click all the variables that you want to include in your analysis. So in our case, there's only the 4 we need, so we'll just use those ones. But if you had an actual data set, you would only pick the ones you need to look at. So the ones that are part of, say, your depression scale or your well-being scale or your, online behavior scale, etc. So then you click on Run Analysis. So it's going to give you kind of a summary under this highlight section. And right now it seems to be flagging something. It says the 4 items did not appear to measure the same outcome. So what they're actually flagging here is that something's wrong. However, it is also saying that the analysis is reliable, and that is the assumptions were met. And the main assumption of this is that they're all using at least the same range of scores, or the same type of measure. So in this case, it's a 7-point Likert scale. So that is fine, but it's still flagging that something's wrong. So if we look here, we have an alpha of 0.023. So if you recall when I showed you the cutoffs in class, anything above a 0.9 is excellent. A 0.8 is like very good. A 0.7 is acceptable. A 0.6 is like weak. And then anything under that kind of 0.5 is kind of terrible, unacceptable. So this case, a 0.02 is really, really bad. So if you look here, this is how the item itself relates to all the other items. So it's kind of using that same scale where anything above a 0.9 is really high. And then if you have a negative value, it means it goes in the opposite direction. So don't worry too much about this. We haven't actually learned correlation yet, but when we do, that'll make more sense. But the important thing to look for right now is what's happening here. So in this case, if you were to remove any of these items, we would end up with kind of a disastrous situation where we're in the negatives and the scale really doesn't make sense. So it's already bad, and this would send us into the negatives, so even worse. However, you'll notice if we remove item 4, suddenly our alpha jumps up to a 0.904. So this is a classic case of, okay, something's wrong with this item. And fortunately, we already know what the issue is, and that was that we didn't actually recode the item. It's still flipped in the wrong direction. So if we go back to our data, we need to actually transform this one into the flipped version. So we are going to do that. So if you recall, you can make a new variable, and we'll call this chat for this is not the new variable section. So we'll call this chat for recoded, and it's going to be a number and it's going to be a calculation. And if you recall, to do this, you need to multiply this by -1, put that in a bracket, and then add the number of points on the Likert scale plus 1. So in this case, it's 8. Everything looks good as long as there's no spaces, and then click. All right, we got the check mark, and now we go back. Okay, and we can see now that things are flipped. 1s are 7s, 2s are 6s, 3s are 5s, etc. So this time we're going to run it again, but we're going to actually use the proper variable. So we'll click run new analysis. And again, we're going to go all the way to the bottom here, grab that Cronbach's alpha. And this time, instead of picking that item, we're going to pick this one, run the analysis. And now you can see that, oh, okay, everything's good. And all of these items are performing approximately the same. However, if you were to drop an item, you would want to drop the one that leaves the alpha the highest. Okay, so in this case, this item here would be the one you want to drop, because if you take any of these two out, the alpha actually drops a bit. So in this case, we're above 0.9, so it is excellent. And what this means now is if you're in kind of that anything over a 0.6, you can then actually use the variable as intended without deleting any items and actually create the mean score or whatever it tells you to do in the instructions for the survey. So if you recall, it was telling us to calculate a mean score to represent chattiness. So in this case, we can actually go back to our data, and we're going to make a new one again. And this one we'll just actually call it chatty, and it's a number and it's a calculation again. And this time we're going to do 1, 2, 3, and the new 4. Put brackets around those and multiply it by, or sorry, divide it by 4. And we have our mean. And now we can see that that's actually the mean chattiness on a score from 1 to 7, where people with higher scores are more chatty and people with lower scores are less chatty. So we can see kind of some less chatty people here. So what would you do in a case that if you check your alpha and it's actually low, you should remove the bad item before you calculate a total score. However, also make sure that before you remove the bad item that you've properly flipped and recoded things as you are supposed to. So that wraps up how to kind of calculate reliability. Next, we're going to look at how to find existing measures and how to establish kind of whether they reported the reliability or not, and also how to report this if you have used an existing measure. Okay, so we have this paper called The Impact of Mindfulness on Empathy, Active Listening, and Perceived Provisions of Emotional Support. So this was published in Communication Research in 2019. It was published by these authors, and you'll see that it basically follows the APA manuscript. So we have the abstract, then we go into the introduction, and then the introduction kind of builds the case for why we need to conduct this study, defines any key terms, and then lists the hypotheses if there are any. Once you get to the methods, you have that first section of participants where you describe kind of who is in the sample, what are their demographic characteristics. You'll notice that the categorical variables have their, they have the proportions listed by putting the number or percentage, and that, you know, any of the continuous variables have the mean, standard deviation, in range. So you have all the info you need there. Then you have this instrument section where each of the variables in the study are explained in terms of how they were measured. So since this is kind of more of a social science, human research piece, a lot of the ways these were measured is by using self-reported instruments with Likert scales. So you'll see that each variable, so, you know, here it's mindfulness, empathy, it could be, you know, depression, anxiety, well-being, commuting behavior, etc. They are described in terms, using kind of a very specific procedure where, and there's a bit of a formula to this, where you essentially say where you got the measure from, what it looks like, how it was scored, how it's interpreted, and whether it met the criteria for internal consistency. So that's that Cronbach's alpha. So if we use the example here, we have empathy. So empathy was measured with the empathetic concerns subscale from the Davis 1994 interpersonal reactivity scale. So that's the IRI. So it's pretty normal that something that's pretty established might actually be pretty old. So you don't need to worry about that so much on these kind of measures. And that's usually because once they've been used a lot, if there's issues or problems, those kind of get published as you go. So usually the older ones are pretty well established in the field. So in this case, having old references actually doesn't matter too much. So then it says how many items are in the scale. So the empathetic concern subscale consists of 7 items. It gives an example of an item or two. And then it says all items were assessed on 5-point scales, and you list the anchors. So 1 does not describe me very well to 5 describes me very well. And then it says that empathetic concern items were internally consistent, and you have our alpha. And then this is actually the mean score for the 7 items. Okay, so if you were to actually look this up, it would tell you to calculate a mean score, and they've actually reported that here. So we have the mean and standard deviation. And then it tells you how to interpret it. And that says here, high scores on this scale indicate higher levels of empathetic concern. So you'll notice, ideally, each of these kind of variables would have their accompanying paragraph, and those accompanying paragraphs would contain all of the same details. And the minimum is kind of right here. But you will notice in this particular study that there's like a bit of a mix. Some cases where you know, it's very short, other cases very long. So this is a bit weird, but you know, it happens. Okay, let's say you wanted to look up how to actually find one of these measures or to get the items or the questions, and so that you can use it in your own study or your own project. So let's use the active empathetic listening option as an example. So you can see here that the reference is right there, and apparently it was from study 1 in this paper. So if we scroll down and go to the reference list, and if we look for the 2011 paper, oh yeah, there it is. So the active empathetic listening scale, conceptualization and evidence of validity within the interpersonal domain. that was published in Communication Quarterly, we actually can go search for that. So what you would want to do is copy that reference and then go look for it either in the University of Ottawa Library or just in Google Scholar. So Google Scholar is pretty handy because you can literally just copy and paste that reference, click search, and then it's going to bring it up right away. And you can see here it's been cited by 146 other studies since 2011. And you have the choice of either, if you're logged into the university website, you can just click on the PDF and it's going to pull it up immediately. If you haven't logged into the library website, you're going to have to click here and then go through the login to get it. But if I just press on this, we'll be able to get the study itself. And then we can see here, okay, that we now have this original validation scale, and you can actually scroll down and get the items themselves. Okay, so this is how you would look for the information. And if there's any kind of scoring information, it would be indicated in the methods of that scale itself here. But you can see just in the original study, they're reporting the alphas to make sure things are measuring what they should be and consistently. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to show you is how to write up your own measures section. So you would have measures, and then, oops, that is bolded, and then anything that's under it would have, any variable would have its own. So we'll call this communication style, and you would bold this, and then we would say communication style was measured using the fake communication style scale, and then you would reference it. So it was author and author 2020. So again, this is all fake stuff. So this scale measures the extent to which people are chatty. So it consists of 4 items, and you could say an example item is I love, and participants indicate their agreement using a 7-point Likert scale. So you'd say 1, do not agree, to 7. Oops. And then we'll say, you know, a mean score is calculated to represent chattiness, and high scores are higher chatty. Yes, so we'll just say that with chattiness. Internal consistency was excellent. And then this is where you would put, okay, that should be a proper alpha. So you'd go to insert, you would find your symbols, which, here we go. We've got our alpha equals, and it was something like 0.92, I believe. So in this case, because alpha can't be bigger than 1, or it won't be smaller than -1 ever. Like if you have a minus, it's a problem. So it runs between 0 and 1. Since that's the case, it means that there is never a value here. So you always carry 3 points behind the decimal. So since this is always 0, it's assumed. So to avoid redundancy in APA, we don't put it. And then everything after is, you keep 3. Okay, so even if you get more numbers, which I don't think you will in StatsCloud, you only keep 3.
Okay, and then finally, just the last thing you need to report is the actual descriptive statistics for this variable you calculated. So you can kind of slide it in anywhere. You could put it here at the end of the sentence. So you could just say, you know, the mean score was this, SDU is this, or you can stick it kind of in the same bracket as the alpha, but you just, like here you're talking about it, so it makes sense to put it here. But this is just so that people know kind of roughly what the score was for the group, and that you have something to tie these high scores too. So it means that I can see, okay, already by looking at this information, I can see that the individual items were ranked between 1 and 7. I can see that a mean score was calculated for those 4 items, and then I can see, I don't know, say it was like 4.45 and a standard deviation of 1, let's say 1.01. So I can see that, okay, well, it looks like people are a little bit kind of more on the chattier side than the non-chattier side overall, and that most people were kind of somewhere in between, because 68% of respondents would have been between basically 5.45 and 3.45. So kind of just over halfway on the scale. So that's why we want to include this info. And there you have it. So that includes everything you need to write up your APA style measures section. Thank you.